really in dire conditions, I think that's when we'll see managers start to reconsider what we're going to do moving forward.
When I was searching to see if there's any polar bear specific podcasts out there. And there's only three podcasts, and two of them were random things with podcasts in the title. And the other one was Coca-Cola, something about Coca-Cola's polar bear. Have you tapped that source for research money? I mean, it had a TM on it, so I'm
Uh,
assuming they've tried to claim polar bears. They need to be invested
yeah,
now, keeping them around.
yeah, we have in the past had some funding from Coke. Tell you the truth, most scientists will take money from almost anyone. It doesn't control what we do nor how we do it, but we've had it from non-governmental organizations. We've had it from industry. We've had money from research councils. The biggest grant I've ever had actually was from the U.S. government to study some issues about polar bears relative to oil development in the Arctic. So, it's again, it's a challenge always to keep this place running, and I think it's probably no different for almost any academic these days to try to keep our research programs moving.
Do you feel pressure when if you get a grant like that to come up with a result one way or the other? I know that's complete polar opposite of what you want from science, but do you feel that pressure? Is there pressure from a management level?
You know, the one nice thing is I have worked in government before, and I was actually a polar bear biologist for the Norwegian government for 7 years. And when you're working in government, there's a lot more pressures inside the system. One of the things I've got to say about being an academic is the freedom to be able to speak about issues freely without fear. And you have to remember, like living in Canada, in Alberta, this is a petroleum province here. We are driven by the tar sands and natural gas production, and it's you think it might be unpopular, but in reality, I've never in my career as an academic felt any external pressure on anything. People may not like what we say, but I've never had anybody sort of try to change what we say. And it's an interesting phenomena. I think when you work inside government, you find there's a lot more massaging of messages, to be politically correct. And yet, in academia, we really are free to make inferences and basically um, professional judgments about the data that we collect and then present that to a broad audience. So it's always kind of surprised me that as a polar bear scientist, I've actually found employment in Alberta, which is of course a fairly conservative province when you get right down to it. But at the same time, um, polar bears sort of cross all boundaries in that respect, and I think even the most sort of fervent sort of conservatives out there understand that protecting the natural world is the right thing to do. And we may differ on some of the fine points. And I think people really are starting to understand the climate change issue now more fully. So, but yeah, from the perspective of pressure on our research, none at all. I don't know what I would actually do if it did happen. It would probably freak me out so much that I probably wouldn't know what to do. But fortunately, it's never happened to me.
I guess that's why I kind of started this podcast. Is I thought there's a lot of information, and I didn't want to be an echo chamber on, say, Facebook or something like that, where I've just got people that I like what they're saying, and I agree with what they're saying, and I delete all the people that I don't like, and I'm left with just this kind of echo chamber of information that rebounds, and it's not necessarily correct. And that goes for both the left and the right. People that want to conserve, and then people that are sort of going, "Ah, don't worry about it." They probably exist in their own echo chambers like that. Is there something about these polar bears that you find specifically why I wanted to speak to you and get the best information? Is there any myths out there used on either side that you think that you want to dispel, things that drive you a little bit bananas?
Well, I think probably this idea that somehow polar bears are going to adapt to climate change. If they were going to adapt to climate change, we would still have polar bears in southern Scandinavia. We'd have them in Finland. We just don't see that potential moving forward. This is a highly specialized species that's really dependent on one or two prey species that rely on sea ice. And it just doesn't get any simpler. It's a habitat loss issue, and you can look at any number of websites from NASA to the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Look at their projections and the trends on sea ice, and it's not complicated. Um, but again, I think because it is such a simple story, people really who don't want to believe it do everything they can to sort of fight against the issue, and so that's probably the most disheartening thing is seeing people try to twist the data. And these aren't polar bear scientists for the most part. These are people that are paid um, lobbyists. They're paid by some of the denier groups, far right wing sorts of agencies that are trying to foment doubt. And I guess they always figured if they could foment doubt in the polar bear story, then it would really be sort of, the nail in the coffin for the whole climate change debate, which it never has been nor never would be, but they've sort of taken it that way. And so, it's like, you see the denier groups and they went after the former Vice President Al Gore about, polar bears drowning. That was always sort of taken to be a fallacy in that movie. And, we're looking at our data now and we've got a paper coming out soon that shows that polar bears are swimming a lot more now than they used to. So within that context, um, bears swimming long distances isn't a real problem, but it is a problem if you're a small cub and you're forced to swim long distances in cold water. They suffer hypothermia and they die. A big storm comes up and the weak bears don't survive. So again, we're changing the rules by which the bears have to live, and at some point, they just can't play by our rules, and that's the challenge going forward for this species anyway.
I feel like one of the myths that drives me a little bananas is when you hear people talk about things like bears and they're like, "Oh, they're so cute. Just want to cuddle them and they just look so cuddly." But I mean, you see a different perspective, don't you? I saw The Revenant, and I think that sort of changed any misconceptions about what a bear would happen to you if you ran into a bear. Um, I think was pretty accurately portrayed in that movie. Is that how you feel about that kind of thing? Do you see what the bears kind of how they hunt and how they look at you if they catch you unawares?
Well, it it's kind of interesting because, polar bears are pretty darn relaxed when it comes to the bear world. If you gave me a choice between running into a grizzly bear or a polar bear, I'd take a polar bear any day. They're just as likely to look at you and walk away, whereas a grizzly bear is just as likely to walk away or tear a strip off you, but probably just as likely to ladder as the former. And, the thing with polar bears, and people always say, oh, they look so beautiful. And yeah, this is a carnivore. They are a killing machine. That's how they make their living. And I talk to people all the time and say, "Oh, I've been out and I've seen, you know, hundreds of polar bears and, none of them have ever caused me any problems." I go, "Yeah." And that's the problem. It's only one bear in 1,000 perhaps that causes a problem that really decides it wants to eat a person. And, if you're just your average tourist, you wander out into polar bear habitat, the problem is it might be the first bear or the 1,000th bear that you see that causes a problem, that attacks you, and they could do some serious damage or kill you. But definitely, eventually, it's going to be the last polar bear you ever see. And that's the problem is they will kill people. They do kill people. There's some pretty good indication that the number of human bear conflict is increasing across the Arctic as a whole. It makes sense. The bears are spending more time on land. That's where people live. A lot of small communities have a lot of good bear attractants that bring bears right into town. And the bottom line is, um, bears are the same everywhere. They look for food. That's kind of what they do. And if you get a hungry bear in your neighborhood, it's going to be trouble. So, um, yeah, I've never been impressed by the idea. I wanted to really just hang around with polar bears. When we're out there, we have lots of guns and dart guns and drugs, and we're in helicopters. And I tell you, you'd better be keeping a close eye over your shoulder if you want to stay in this.
Do you feel a pressure then to get on the treadmill when it comes up to expedition season? You don't want to appear too fat rich or anything like that to a polar bear. Maybe choose a very low profile coat so you don't
Yeah,
get mistaken.
you just choose really slow moving graduate students.
Yeah, I was going to say that could be a very effective anti obesity campaign in children.
Yeah, it might be. Unfortunately, I think I'm getting so old that probably just take a couple of my students and push me over and say, "There's the sacrifice, run."
Hey, Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show. And for the listeners out there, I recommend following Andrew's Twitter feed. It's very entertaining and informative. And also, Google Scholar is very kind to you, Andrew. If you type in your name, pretty much get a pretty healthy serve of papers and citations that you can use. Just before we go, I just had a look and you deviated just quickly into wolves. What sort of work are you doing on that?
Yeah, a little bit. We don't do a lot of work on wolves. It was a project that we've been working on for a number of years. We were looking at less invasive techniques to try to monitor populations and structure of wolves in Alberta here. I've done wolves work in the high Arctic as well. I'll work on almost any large mammal. Polar bears are pretty much what I spend most of my days doing now. But we do some work on grizzly bears and caribou and even peregrine falcons. I've got eclectic interests. Like I say, the bears kind of chose me and they're kind of my number one species. But at the same time, being an academic and having a vibrant research group, having that sort of diversity here is really important, sort of to have that feedback from one student that's working on a very different system. It creates that sort of thrill of discovery and integration and different ideas that makes it really fun to place the work and to interact with these really bright young people.
Now, finally, as a call to action, if people want to get involved and people want to help out your efforts, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the number one thing is I always come back to it. It's understanding the issue, and if you understand the issue and the science behind climate change, it's a really good way to get a foundation. There's lots of really good websites that can give you that sort of baseline information. There's also a lot of really bad ones that'll give you just as much misinformation. One of the groups that I work with and volunteer my time with is a group called Polar Bears International. And they have some really excellent resources, lots of good links for teachers. They have good sort of course planning work that they can follow. It's a really solid group that really provides some basics. I have also volunteered with World Wildlife Fund as well. Another group that does a lot of good work, a lot of on the ground work to try to reduce polar bear conflict and the number of bears that are killed around communities, for example. So those are two groups that I think give people at least a toehold in the polar bear world. And from there, I tell you, you put Google to work and you'll find no end of information out there. And, if somebody can't find an answer to their question, I tell you, I've answered hundreds and hundreds of emails from, kindergarten right through to universities. If you can't find an answer, I'd be surprised, but you can always give me a try.
Andrew Derocher, thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Well, it's been my pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, that was Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta, Andrew Derocher. Polar bears have been his main study for 30 years and he's incredibly active in the scene. I do encourage you to follow his Twitter, which is twitter.com/AEDerocher, DEROCHER, to stay in touch and some very likable and very shareable links. Well, that's a wrap for episode 3 of the Univi Podcast. So stay in touch via Twitter or Facebook. And if there's anybody that you'd particularly like us to speak to, drop us a line and we're happy to have any conversation anytime. Catch you later.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to the Univi Podcast. To follow our series, please subscribe to our channel via iTunes, Beyond Pod, or the equivalent service. And if you particularly enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate. For further information, news, videos, and articles, head to univi.com.au.